Wow, you really weren't kidding about this being a deep dive. I mean, we've got legal filings, government reports, even sections of the Mueller report. It's a lot.
It is. It seems like you want to understand what happened in the aftermath of the 2016 election, right?
Right. It's like a puzzle with all these different pieces, and some of them are pieces we don't usually get to see, like these juror statements from the Roger Stone case. I was really surprised to see those included.
Yeah, those are pretty unique. The jurors in that case were really worried about what might happen if the questionnaires they filled out, during jury selection, if those were ever made public.
I can understand why. I mean, it looks like they felt like those questionnaires had some pretty sensitive information, stuff they shared, because they thought it would be kept confidential.
Exactly. It's almost like a private conversation between the judge and the lawyers.
Right. And they're worried about, you know, potential harassment or threats if that information ever gets out.
Yeah. It's a valid concern. It seems like there's always this tension between transparency and protecting the people who are caught up in these high-profile legal battles.
Absolutely. It's a tough balance.
It is. And that tension becomes even more pronounced when we look at something like Russian interference in the election, which, the Miller report goes into in a lot of detail.
Yeah, the Mueller report really lays out the extent of the Russian effort to influence the 2016 election.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot in here about the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, and how they used social media to spread disinformation and try to create chaos among American voters.
It's really fascinating in a disturbing sort of way how the IRA operated. They created all these fake social media accounts designed to look like they belonged to real Americans.
I know, and they used them to push all this divisive content and propaganda.
Right.
It's crazy how sophisticated their operation was. The report even gives some specific examples of these fake accounts, like at 10GOP, which was pretending to be the account for the Tennessee Republican Party.
Oh, wow.
And it had tens of thousands of followers. And none of them knew they were actually getting fed propaganda from Russia.
It's amazing how easily people can be manipulated, especially online. And it wasn't just limited to social media. The IRA also organized real-world political rallies and protests here in the U.S.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Oh, yeah. They used their network of fake accounts to, promote these events and make it seem like there was all this grassroots support for their agenda.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that a foreign government could have that kind of direct impact on our political discourse.
I know. It's pretty unsettling.
So the Mueller report also talks about the hacking activities of the GRU, which is Russia's military intelligence agency.
Right. They targeted organizations like the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and the Clinton campaign.
Stealing emails and documents and then leaking them through platforms like DC Leaks and WikiLeaks.
Exactly.
Remember Guccifer 2.0? That was one of the online personas the GRU used to release the stolen information.
I had almost forgotten about that.
I know, it seems like ancient history now. But the report is very clear that those actions were meant to harm Hillary Clinton's candidacy and benefit Donald Trump's campaign.
It's hard to say for sure if they actually succeeded in changing the outcome of the election, but it is concerning to see how much effort a foreign power put into interfering in our democratic processes.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole Trump Tower Moscow project that seems like a perfect example of how business dealings and political ambitions can get all tangled up.
Right. And it raises all sorts of questions about transparency and potential conflicts of interest.
Not to mention Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, and his attempts to downplay the project's significance.
He eventually admitted that he lied to Congress about the timeline of the project and about how much Trump knew about it.
And the report even analyzes whether there were any campaign finance violations connected to the project.
It acknowledges that it's difficult to prove knowing and willful intent, but it's clear that this whole project was a major focus of the Mueller investigation.
It really shows you how hard it can be to separate business from politics, especially when foreign entities are involved. But the Mueller report doesn't just focus on foreign interference, does it? It also delves into the possibility of obstruction of justice by President Trump himself.
Right. That's a big part of the report. It analyzes the president's actions related to the SBI's investigation into Russian interference, and it looks at 10 specific episodes where the president's actions raised questions about whether he was trying to obstruct justice.
Like his interactions with James Comey, who was the director of the FBI at the time.
Yeah, including Trump's attempts to influence Comey and then ultimately his decision to fire him.
It's a really complicated area of law. And in the end, the Mueller report doesn't actually reach a definitive conclusion on whether Trump obstructed justice. It just lays out the evidence and the analysis and kind of leaves it up to interpretation.
which of course led to a lot of debate and discussion. But it's still a really valuable look at the legal and constitutional issues surrounding presidential power and, the limits of that power.
Yeah, it's like a case study in how these really complex legal concepts apply to the actions of a sitting president, which is, an incredibly rare and sensitive situation. And speaking of sensitive situations, we also have documents related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which seems like it was a culmination of a lot of the things we've been talking about.
Absolutely. The January 6th report, which was put together by the House Select Committee, it goes into a lot of detail about the events leading up to that day, including Trump's attempts to pressure state officials to overturn the election results.
It's hard to believe, but the report actually details how Trump personally called officials in states like Georgia and urged them to find enough votes to change the outcome.
And then there's his constant promotion of these claims about election fraud, which the report really digs into.
The report also looks at Trump's actions on January 6th itself,
Yeah.
like his speech to his supporters, where he told them to march on the Capitol. And the report's conclusion is pretty striking. They say that Trump likely obstructed an official proceeding and might have even been involved in a conspiracy to defraud the United States.
It's a sobering reminder that even in a country like ours, with a long history of democratic norms and institutions, things can go very wrong very quickly. And I think that's what all of these documents are trying to tell us, that there are some real vulnerabilities in our system, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited.
It feels like we've covered a lot of ground, but we're really just scratching the surface. I mean, we've got the Roger Stone case, the Miller Report's findings on Russian interference and potential obstruction of justice, and then the January 6th attack. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but I think what's important to remember is that all of these seemingly separate events, they're actually connected. They reveal a pattern of challenges to the very core of our institutions.
That's a really good point. It's not just about individual incidents. It's about a broader trend that we need to understand.
Right. In the next part of our deep dive, I'd like to try to connect those dots a bit more, to highlight some of the recurring themes and explain why they matter so much for the future of American democracy.
So we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff, like jurors worried about their safety and a president potentially obstructing justice and then a mob storming the Capitol. It's kind of a lot to process.
You're right. It is a lot. But I think if we can zoom out a little and look at the bigger picture, we can start to see how all these things connect. Like, they reveal some pretty unsettling trends in American politics and, society in general.
That's what I keep coming back to, the connections. What are the threads that tie all of this together? It feels like there's something bigger going on here.
Definitely. And one of the most obvious threads is misinformation. It's like everywhere, on social media, on talk radio, even in official statements. It's like we're drowning in a sea of lies and half-truths, and it makes it so hard to even have a rational conversation.
I totally agree. It's like we can't even agree on what's true anymore. And the Mueller report, when it talks about the IRA and what they were doing, it really highlights how dangerous misinformation can be. This wasn't just some random people trolling online. It was a deliberate campaign to manipulate public opinion.
And it's not just Russia, right? Think about the events leading up to January 6th. That whole thing was fueled by this constant stream of false claims about the election being stolen, claims that were amplified by certain politicians and media outlets.
So you're saying the January 6th attack, it wasn't just a spontaneous outburst. It was actually the result of this long-term campaign to undermine trust in the electoral process.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second major theme that emerges from all these documents: the erosion of trust in institutions. Think back to the Roger Stone case and those jurors who were worried about their safety. I think that reflects this broader sense of unease that a lot of people feel, like the systems that are supposed to protect us are failing.
It's interesting because the Stone case, on its own, it wasn't about election interference or the January 6th attack, right? But it exposes this vulnerability, this lack of faith in the legal system. That becomes even more significant when we look at it in the context of everything else that was going on.
Absolutely. And when you read through the Miller report and the January 6th report, it's clear that some people were actively trying to undermine trust in institutions that didn't support their narrative, Like the FBI, the Justice Department, the courts, even Congress, they were all targeted in this effort to discredit them and make people question their legitimacy.
So it's not just that trust is eroding on its own, it's being intentionally eroded as a political strategy.
That's right, and it's a very dangerous strategy because these institutions are the foundation of our democracy. Without trust in these institutions, it becomes incredibly difficult to address complex challenges, to find common ground, to, govern effectively.
It feels like this loss of trust is just feeding a vicious cycle. The less trust we have in our institutions, the easier it is for misinformation to spread. And the easier it is for misinformation to spread, the less trust we have.
You've got it. It's a downward spiral, and it has really serious implications for the future of American democracy, especially when it comes to the integrity of our elections.
And that's the third major theme that comes up again and again in these documents, right? The vulnerability of our electoral system.
Yes. We see it in the Mueller report, how Russia interfered in 2016, and then we see it again in the January 6th report, how certain individuals tried to exploit weaknesses in the system to overturn the 2020 election results.
It's a reminder that our democracy, it's not invincible. It requires us to be vigilant, to be committed to the truth, and to be willing to defend it against those who would try to undermine it.
I agree. These documents aren't just historical accounts, they're warnings. They highlight how fragile our democracy is, and they urge us to be active participants in protecting it.
So we've identified these three major themes: misinformation, erosion of trust, and the vulnerability of our electoral system. It's kind of a bleak picture,
Yeah.
I have to admit. So what do we do with all of this? Where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question. And while these documents don't offer any easy solutions, they do give us a starting point. They help us understand the challenges, which is the first step in addressing them.
It's like they give us the diagnosis, but it's up to us to find the cure. And I'm hoping that's what we can explore in the last part of this deep dive.
I think that's a great idea. Let's shift our focus from identifying the problems to thinking about potential solutions. Because even though these challenges are serious, I really believe that we can overcome them. As citizens, we have the power to make a difference.
You've laid out some really serious challenges to American democracy, but I'm also hearing a lot of hope in your voice. It seems like you really believe we can actually turn things around.
I do, I really do. These challenges are big, no doubt, and they're complex, but I don't think they're impossible to overcome. We have the power to make a difference, you and I and every citizen. We just have to use it.
I like that. But what does that actually look like? Where do we even start? Let's take misinformation, for example. We're bombarded with it constantly. How can we possibly fight against that?
Well, it can feel overwhelming, that's for sure. But one of the most powerful tools we have is skepticism. We need to question everything, be wary of those attention-grabbing headlines and emotional appeals, and especially be careful about information that just reinforces what we already believe.
So, like, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Exactly. And don't just rely on social media for your news. Get out there and find diverse viewpoints. Read credible news sources from all sides of the political spectrum. And, don't be afraid to question your own assumptions.
That makes sense. But what about when we encounter misinformation in our daily lives? Should we just ignore it? Or should we, get into arguments with everyone who posts something we think is wrong?
Well, ignoring it just lets it spread. And arguing, well, that can be tempting, but it's usually not very productive. A better approach is to politely correct the misinformation when you see it and share accurate information from reliable sources.
So be skeptical, find different perspectives, and correct misinformation when we can. Okay, that's good advice for individuals. But what about on a larger scale? What can we do to address this erosion of trust in our institutions? That seems so fundamental.
Rebuilding trust takes time. It's a long process, and it requires us to approach it from many angles. But transparency is absolutely key. Institutions need to be open about how they operate, the decisions they make, even their mistakes. And accountability is just as important. When people in positions of power abuse that power or fail to live up to their responsibilities, they need to be held accountable.
It's like that old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Exactly. And we also need to demand ethical behavior from our leaders. They really do set the tone for the whole system. When they lie, cheat, or put their own interests above the public good, it undermines trust in everything.
Transparency, accountability, ethical leadership. All right, I'm with you on that. But what about the really big issue, the one that seems to be at the root of so much of this, the vulnerability of our electoral system? What can we do to protect our elections and make sure they're free and fair and secure?
Protecting our elections is absolutely vital. They're the foundation of our democracy. We have to be vigilant against voter suppression. That's a huge one. We need to support organizations that are working to make our elections more secure, to fight against misinformation, and to get people involved in the process.
That means voting, right?
Of course, voting is so important. Every election, whether it's for a local school board or for president, it's a chance to exercise our rights and make our voices heard.
And to do that well, we have to stay informed. We need to know what the issues are and who the candidates are so we can make good decisions.
Exactly. Being an informed and engaged citizen, that's one of the most powerful things you can do to protect our democracy.
So we've come a long way in this deep dive. From jurors worried about their privacy to Russian interference to this really deep systemic loss of trust. It's been a lot to absorb, to be honest.
I know it's a lot, but I want to emphasize again that even though these problems are real and they're serious, they're not insurmountable. We have the power to change things. We, the people.
I love that. That's a great place to end, I think. To our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We know you care about these issues, and we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and maybe even a little bit of hope.
Remember, the future of our democracy is in our hands. Stay informed, stay involved, and never doubt that your voice matters.